Welcome to the Kid Men Podcast with Dr. Val and Dr. Virginia, where we talk about everything kid men.
And pull back the curtain on some of the surprises and challenges in children's ministry that nobody prepares you for.
I'm Dr. Val, and together we have over 45 years of experience in children's ministry.
I'm Dr. Virginia. Valerie and I met over 10 years ago in our doctoral program at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. We are excited to share with you all the great stuff that we have picked up over the years. We want to minister to you, the children's minister.
Welcome, friends. We are so excited that you chose to join us today. We have a really exciting episode for you.
We are super excited about our interview with David Reneau. He is a longtime children's minister, longtime children's ministry leader. He also has a blog with lots of great resources and information for children's ministry leaders. And we have a great conversation today about leaving well. Whenever it's time to move on from your role or from your ministry, how do we prepare our ministry and prepare ourselves in some ways to leave well?
Right.
When it's time to transition.
Right. Because we all have transitions that are going to happen in our ministry and our lives. We're going to be led to a new place of service, or it might not be our choice to find a new place for service. And so we just never kind of know what's going to happen around the corner. And I think it's so important to be prepared. And that's what David's going to help us do today. And, we enjoyed our conversation with David Reneau so very much that we actually talked a lot longer than we expected to. So this is part one of our conversation with David Reneau.
All right. We are here this morning with David Reneau. We are so excited. Let's just start out. David, tell us a little about yourself, where you're from, where do you serve, how did you get into kids ministry, and then also a little about your blog. So just tell us a little about yourself, David.
Yeah, so I have been, thanks for having me on here. I'm so thankful for being here. It's great to meet you ladies virtually. And I've been in ministry for 15 years. I was in children's ministry for 13 of those. I spent the last 15 months in Next Gen ministry. I oversaw youth and kids as the associate pastor at my last church. I grew up in Georgia. And that's, I've been all around the Southeast. I spent 10 years in Florida. I spent 7 years in Alabama. And so I'm back in Georgia. So I feel like I'm home again. So I met my wife in college, and so she works for, I'm with the Assemblies of God. So she works for the district in the children's ministry department there. And so we've been married for 15 years. I started my first job in children's ministry in May of 2008. And then we got married in August of 2008 because I needed to get in-state tuition. And the best way to get in-state tuition is to marry a resident.
So romantic.
Romantic. We've been dating for 2 years by that point anyway. So like we were just, it was coming. But we did VBS the week before we got married. I do not recommend.
Wow.
Yeah. That was an insane Kidmin summer. I've had other ones, but that's top 10 right there. The top 5, maybe top 3. Yeah.
That's pretty high up there on the,
yeah. So anyway, we have one son. He's 8, just started third grade. And he's loving life, and he loves video games like his dad. And we're having a good time. So with my blog, I've been writing for several years now. I started writing when I was in Montgomery. Actually, I started writing when I was in Clearwater, Florida, 12 years ago. But you don't want to go back to those posts. Those are buried deep in the annals. I go back and look, and I was like, oh, it's like reading old Facebook memories from like when you posted your status in 2008. I'm like, what was I thinking? That's the way I feel about those posts. But they're there, so you can get those out. And this week I just launched my new website, davidreneau.org, and so you can have all my blog posts up there. I have resources to help you lead in ministry better, specifically in Kidmin. So you can check those out, and just lead well, because that's what I'm trying to do, is help other people lead well. Because when I first started in children's ministry, I felt completely alone, and that like no one understood my plight. I remember there was a couple weeks in a row where the adult service had gone long. And, back then our services were like 2 hours long, and then it went longer. And so, okay, we've played this game 10 times. And so I went to the worship pastor and be like, dude, you got to give me a heads up or tell me something, like, you're going to get through this. And he's like, what's your problem? And I'm like, okay, we're in the wrong place. So I found a guy like y'all. He'd been in the ministry for 10 years, and he did a podcast, and I listened to it and was like, oh, he gets it. So I decided, okay, I'm going to start blogging to help people like me that are just lost, and you've been doing this for a little bit, and you don't know what's going on. So you need to talk to somebody. You need to hear somebody that understands where you are and can help you move ahead and make decisions.
It just makes such a huge difference. I look back at my early years, and I just so wish that we had those kind of resources available back then. It's one of the reasons why Virginia and I talked about even starting this podcast, is because it was just so hard starting out and not having that support, and not having, somebody that you could talk to and figure things out through. And so it just makes such a huge difference. And so it's exciting that you're offering those resources for leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I love it.
Thank you. Well, and our topic for this morning is kind of, I guess, on the opposite end of the spectrum of getting started. It's leaving well. Because we were talking about this before we hit record, that one way or another, we're all going to eventually leave the ministries that we're at, whether it's a move to a new ministry or the Lord calls us home. One way or another, we're not going to be in our ministries forever. And so I just had read several of David's blogs that were just really great about preparing your church and preparing your ministry to leave well. And so I feel like that's one of the hardest questions that we'll grapple with in ministry, is knowing when it's time to go, knowing if God's calling us somewhere else, kind of that discernment between staying and going. And so what are some of your thoughts on how we know when it's time to go, or how we know if we should stay?
Yeah. When you like, especially like in my denomination, in Assemblies of God, and I think it's true in Baptist, it feels like you're called to a place. There's this lot of this conversations about being called, and like, this is in the place that God has for you to be. And so when you start getting that discomfort, that pull, that discontent with where you are, you start questioning, like, sometimes you can even start questioning your faith. Like,
should I be doing this at all?
And so you start like, okay, God, is this really where you want me to go? And so really you have to like bathe it in prayer. When I left my first church in Clearwater, I prayed. I felt like the Lord told me, okay, it's time for you to start looking. And we had conversation, me and the Lord had conversations, as a light term. There was pretty heated arguments about me going because of stuff going on. But I ultimately decided, okay, he wants me to stay for this time. And then when I got the message from him saying, okay, it's time for you to go, I was like, nah. And so I sat on it for a month and just prayed about it. I didn't even tell my wife about it. I was like, you're like, is this really? And then when I came to her, that was in June. At the beginning of July, I told her what was going on, and she's like, okay, yeah, let's do it. So a lot of times that's where the movement is. But a lot of times I was talking to a guy just this week. He was a kids pastor with me in Florida, and he left the ministry because he got burned out. Like he just wore himself out, because what can happen in ministry is that I like what Carey Nieuwhof says, is that it's not.
We love Carey Nieuwhof.
We do.
Love it. Yeah. He says, what we talk about burnout. He says, it's not that you need a break from your pace. From your unsustainable pace. It's not like you need a break. You need to actually make your pace sustainable. And so many times in ministry, we can get so burnt out. We can keep pushing and pushing and pushing. Especially, I see this a lot of times with children's pastors coming out of the education world and then coming into ministry, because they run it like they do education, where it's a full-on sprint until Christmas break, and then to spring break, and then to a summer break. But ministry doesn't work like that.
You don't have a break.
Yeah, I'm a runner. And so I think about it. I'm not doing interval training where I'm like taking breaks. I'm doing long distance stuff. And when I do long distance stuff, it's consistent, but it's slower.
You got to pace yourself.
Exactly. And there's sometimes, like I was running this morning where I went up this gigantic, massive hill. I literally felt like I needed to crawl up the hill. When I got up to the top, I just hit pause and I'm like, oh my God. Yeah. It's like, oh, it was awful. But there's sometimes where, like, when you feel like you're being burnt out, that like you need to just hit pause, and then you need to rework, and you need to reevaluate and determine, okay, is this me leaving? Like, do I need to leave this place?
Right.
Or is this, maybe I just need to change my responsibilities. I need to give some things away. I've taken on too many things. I need to start saying no. And then you can get through, you can stay in your place where you are. Another reason why you may come in there is that you've kind of reached your lid, that, you're growing as a leader. You're growing as a staff person, you're growing as a Christian. And there's sometimes, and this gets tricky, but there's sometimes where, like, the church is not going where you're going. And so, like, you've kind of like, okay, I can't push anymore. I describe it like, I felt this way at one of my churches when I left it. I felt like I was spinning my tires. I was doing everything I could to get this ministry going, to get the leadership rolling, to get, and it just, nothing was getting traction. And the confirmation of that is that when I went to my next church, I took all of those systems and all those things that I had developed, I transplanted them to a different church in a different state, a different context, and we just took off like a rocket ship. And I had just, but trying to, there's pride in there, and there's ego in that. And that is, when I made that transition, there was pride and there was ego as a part of that. And part of me being at that next church was a humbling experience for me. So, that's still kind of, sometimes you reach your lid of where you're going.
And I think it's amazing too, because you would think that when a church comes together to do something, they'll have this vision and they'll want to move forward. Like, I've talked to a lot of children's ministers where the church is saying, we want to grow. We want the new building. We want to do this. We want the young families. We want to do. And then when you start to lead them in that way, you realize, oh, they don't really want to change. They think it sounds really good to say it. But there comes a point where you have to really look realistically, not just at yourself, but at your ministry, and say, is this family really wanting to move forward in the way that they're saying, or is this, and so I think that that's an important thing for us to think about when we're looking at the situation.
People love change until it affects them.
Right.
When it affects them, then they're like, this is not what I signed up for.
This is insane.
And so you just gotta, there's sometimes you just got to keep pushing forward. And there's sometimes where people are going to go with you. And there's sometimes they're going to say, no, I'm out. I'm not going to go anywhere. So there's other times where, like, you feel like you have accomplished your mission. Like, you've been there. God has called you to a place and to accomplish these things. And then you've done those things. And you're like, okay, I think I'm done. Like you kind of, it's not even like a loss of passion. Like, you still love kids, you still love what you're doing, but you're just kind of like, you're just doing the thing to, to go back to the tire thing. It's like you got a flat tire, clunk. You're just doing the clunk. You're just doing the same thing over and over again. And it's like, okay, maybe we've done everything. Maybe we need a new challenge. And so when you're thinking about, like, should I stay or should I go? Maybe you are looking for a new challenge. Maybe it's time for you to step out of children's ministry. Maybe it's time for you to take on something else. Or maybe that's you leaving your role. And then ultimately, like, there's a value in staying. When I first did this blog post that we're talking about ministry training, the guy was like, dude, you've been in ministry for 15 years. You've been at 14 churches. I mean, not 14 churches, 4 churches. 14 would be insane.
That'd be too much.
You've been in ministry for 15 years. You've been at 4 churches. That's just not a long time. You weren't in any one place really long. And we had a little bit of conversation about it. And as a person who has changed churches so often, there is a longing and a loss there of seeing kids who were in my first ministry and even in my second ministry who are grown and now have kids. And I wasn't part of their lives for that. And I'm not a part of their lives. Like I see it on Facebook and I see it on Instagram, and I can see it and I can cheer them on and like, oh yeah, hey, this is the kids pastor over there. But it's just, you miss that part. And there's other people like Brian Dollar, who's been in ministry, in kids ministry for like over 20 years. Right. He calls himself the Slam Paw because he's got kids in his ministry that their parents were in his ministry. Right. And there's just a beauty to that. But I also, when I think about it, I think for two of us, there's kind of like 2 types of ministers. There's Peter, who never left Israel. He was between Galilee and he was in Jerusalem, and he kind of, sometimes he went over to Capernaum. He was in that same area his whole life. He didn't really travel. But then there was Paul, who traveled around. Who went around. He spent 2 years here. He spent 3 years over there. He was always moving around. And so there's sometimes in our ministry where we can be Peter, and there's sometimes in our ministry we be Paul, or we can be some, when we look back on the story of our lives, it could be a mixture of the two. Right. It's different for every person. And it really depends on you just following the will of God and where he's leading you.
Right. And I think I don't think that we can diminish either one. And I think sometimes people will feel like, oh, well, there's people that have been there forever and I haven't been. But it's like you said, I think God gives us different seasons in our lives, and some are longer than others. And it's so hard because with children's ministry, I believe there's just so much emotion built into what we do as well, because we start to care for the kids and the families so much. And so it's different from a job where you might work in an office with a few people that you get to know. You're meeting hundreds of people and families, and you're becoming involved in their lives, and it changes the way you look at
and situations. We're there for families, some of their most significant moments in their life, the birth of their children, whenever children choose to follow Christ, death of grandparents. And so we walk alongside them in these tremendous milestones in life. And so we do get really invested in a way that you don't necessarily in other places. So
there was a family when I was in Montgomery. That was where I was the longest. I was there for 7 years. And one of the matriarchs of the family passed away, and she spent a week in the hospital, and all the other pastors went on a mission trip, and I was the only one on call, the kids pastor, but most of the family worked in children's ministry. So I had relationships with them, and I had been there for 7 years at that point. And so I was in the room when they were making the decision to pull the plug. But that was only because of the relationship that I had built with this entire family. And you only get there when you've been there that long, when you get to be there for their darkest moments, and then being able to speak at their funeral and be there after and talk with them and be the comfort person. And they were an African-American family, and I am white as white can be, but it was it didn't matter because I was there, and they appreciated me being there for them in that time.
Yeah. And I think that makes it even more difficult to make these decisions when you feel like it's time to move, when God is moving you.
You're I've invested so much.
There was definitely, especially when I decided it was time to leave children's ministry, there was a mourning that happened. Of there was this song, Jesus, You're My Superhero. I think Hillsong Kids did it years ago.
I remember that one.
Did y'all know this song? Yeah. So I sang that all throughout my ministry. And then I remember my son had just gotten old enough to be in kids ministry. And then he's at home singing that song. And just thinking about I'm getting choked up just thinking about it. Think about all those kids who I taught that Jesus is my superhero and singing those songs. And then here is my 4-year-old son doing the same moves, singing the same song and thinking like, this is the last time.
Yeah.
This is going to be it. And that's, you know, when you leave, it's a mourning because it's a breaking of a relationship. It's a breaking of whether you leave the ministry as a whole, you leave children's ministry, or you just leave the church. There's a mourning process that needs to happen for you and for the people of like, because this relationship is no longer going to continue in the way it has.
Right. And you need to allow yourself time to grieve for that. A lot of times we think, oh, we need to push on and move forward and head to the next thing, which we do.
Yeah.
But I think that we need to allow ourselves the grace to grieve when we go through that.
Yeah. I think it's a horrible idea. Like when you leave a church to go start at the next church the following Sunday, like you said goodbye this Sunday, and then you give yourself 6 days and you're at the next church and say, no, do not do that. Ask for some space. Even if you can't afford it, God will bless you. It's like, take at least a month to move your family and to, you know, get set up in the community that you're in, to mourn that change. Go visit other churches in the area. Go visit, like, I went and visited Andy Stanley's church, North Point Church, in between almost every transition I've been to. I went to Church Highlands a couple of times. You know, like that's the place I don't get to go to on Sunday because I'm working. Right. So, so I get to go. So go visit those churches and you know, be refreshed and be renewed yourself before you go start filling somebody else's cup in a new place.
That's great advice.
So let's talk a little bit about the timing of notifying senior leadership or your personnel committee or whoever it is about leaving, because I think we have this desire that we want to give people notice to be able to prepare, but then also sometimes that can backfire. And so let's talk a little bit about some of these considerations with the timing of notifying your church that you're leaving.
Yeah. So there's 2 considerations here. And the first one is the senior pastor determines your pace. You do not usurp them, because they are the one, they were there most likely, they were there before you, and they most likely will be there after you. And so they got to deal with the mess of you leaving. So you need to go at the pace in which they want you to go. And sometimes that's faster than you want, and sometimes that's slower than you want. But you have to work with them, because you are there. You are at their privilege, or you know, that they are the ones who are allowing you to stay and be at those places. So the other consideration is, go ahead and have this conversation now, whether you're thinking about leaving or not. Like, it's, you know, you're going to be there for the rest of your life. Go ahead and have this conversation. Talk about somebody else that recently left a church, and just bring it up in conversation. And then ask your pastor, what do they want? Which would they rather do? Would they rather to be told, hey, told like, I'm leaving tomorrow, like I found a new job and I'm going? Or do you want to be told months and weeks in advance, I'm thinking about leaving? Which one do you want? Because I've heard the horror stories of like going into the pastor and it's like, hey, I'm thinking about leaving. And said, well, if you're thinking about leaving, go ahead. Go ahead and clean out your desk. You're done. We'll see you later. And that's the fear that we have. So just go ahead and have that conversation head on, make it low stakes. Like I said, talk about somebody else who recently left. Talk about your predecessor. And like, you know, just bring up like, hey, this other person that was there, how did they leave? And how do you feel about that? And, you know, just have those, because the way they reacted in those past times will help you make your decision, will help inform you when you tell them what's going on.
Right. Maybe we listen to the same episode of the Carrie Newhoff podcast, because there was one episode where I can't even remember who he was interviewing, but whoever it was said that it was like on their first day, they went in and asked senior leadership just exactly what you're saying. Like, okay, obviously I just got here, not going anywhere. But whenever that time comes, how do you want me to handle it? And I was like, oh, that's phenomenal.
Because it really is true, because I've been in ministry for a very long time and have made lots of different transitions over the years. And I've had that exact same thing happen, where I've had a pastor say, we understand, we're going to work with you. please don't tell anyone though until we're ready to make the announcement. So I've had to go a week or two without being able to tell anybody we were actually moving because, you know, the pastor wanted to wait until he felt like he had everything ready before he told. And then I've also had the pastor who have said, well, if you're leaving, then let's go clean out your office today and we'll, you know, we'll head out with you. So it's that, you know, like, you know, it really, and I think a lot of it is their emotion too, and how they handle things and how well they're handling it. But you have to sort of be prepared for either one. You might be walking out that day. You might have to keep everything quiet for a while, but you do have to just follow the lead of the senior pastor. That's the important thing.
Right. Yeah. So they're after you've had that conversation, let's say that they are amenable to the person leaving and they want to help you move on to that, because that's in my case, that every church I've been to, that has been the case where the pastor and like it's taken me over a year to find the next place because of different things, and the pastor was working with me, you know, helping me, giving me guidance as we walk through those times. When you are in that in-between space, it is imperative that you keep your level of work up.
Right.
Because what you don't want to do is that just because you're looking, that you're checking out.
Right.
Because how you leave determines your legacy. And if you start checking out, if you quit doing stuff, if you just start going through the motions, that is the way people are going to remember you. Right. And you don't want them to do that. The church that I said where I looked for over a year, just because of I'll talk more about this in a second, but just because the way it went is like, we made the announcement on Sunday, and then we did the party the following Sunday, and the Sunday after that I was gone. Right, you know, it was like a 2-week time to prep the church for it. But I had been looking for over a year and no one knew. No one had any idea, because I kept that level of work and kept pushing the ministry forward and kept like preparing things. And I remember there were some times I was just sitting in classes, like planning out stuff we're going to do the fall. And I was like, I don't even know if we're going to be here for that.
Right.
But, you know, they don't know that. And I can't tell them. So that's where we are. So what you want to do when you're having this conversation, first person you need to talk to is your senior pastor and determine who they want you to tell. And most likely what they're going to say is they don't want you to tell anybody. They want you to keep this completely in control. And so that was the way it stayed. The two of us had this conversation. We had this ongoing thing. I gave him updates as we went along. And things worked as, you know, just as we went along. And then once the church, like, okay, this church looks like this is going to be higher. This is going to be the place to go. That was when he said, okay, what we're going to do is you can go ahead and tell your team. And I had been begging him to tell my team, because like, it's getting closer and I got to get them prepared for what's coming. Right. So I told my top level leaders first. Actually, we told the staff first. Like, he called everybody in and we announced to the staff, and then he told the top level leaders. And what he wanted us to do, he swore us all to secrecy, because what he wanted to do is, one, he didn't want the congregation to know, because once the congregation knows, you're a lame duck and you can't do anything. And two, he wanted to let the board know. He wanted to let them know, because he is accountable to the board, and one of his employees are leaving. And, you know, and so he wanted to let the board know. And that was part of the reason why my timeline was so shortened, because he left for vacation the day I accepted the job. And so I had to wait for the 3 weeks for him to come back to go tell the board in person. And so even for me, like, I was checking out in, like, you know, a month. For the way the church felt, it was like a week.
Right.
So,
and those transitions can be so tricky, because you have people that you are really close to that you want to tell that you can't. And so you know that there's that risk of them finding out, which I've had that happen before, where people's feelings were hurt. And I was like, I'm so sorry, but I couldn't say, I couldn't talk about it yet. And also there's little things like, you know, if you have to put your house up for sale, or if you, or if the church that you're going to is wanting to promote you coming. So you know, it's all of those little things that you have to make sure the timing just fits right. And it can be a challenge.
It can be. And so the way I think about it is that you are working in concentric circles. it starts with just two, you and your spouse. And then you throw in a third person of, now you've thrown in your senior pastor.
Right.
Okay. Now, and then you go staff, that's a little bit bigger. And then you go your top leaders, not your whole team, your top leaders. Okay. And then after you tell your top leaders, then you tell your volunteer team. Okay. And then after you tell your volunteer team, then you tell your kids and or the congregation. And so for me, the way it worked is that we told the board, and we told the staff, we told my top team, they knew weeks or about a month in advance about here's what's coming.
Yeah.
I then clued in my entire volunteer team the Sunday morning before the announcement. In our pre-service meeting, that's when I told my volunteer team, this is what's going on. Because they, now there's like instead of being 10 people in the loop, now there's 50. Right. And it's hard for them to keep a thing. And they're going to be emotional because I've been there for a while. So they're like, oh my gosh, he's leaving. And so I told them that what was going on. And then I announced it and then we did the service normally. And then at the end of the service, I told the kids what was happening. At the same time, the pastor was making the announcement in the sanctuary. And there are some times where I've gone over and had the opportunity to be there for the announcement. My last Sunday there, I actually did a baptism. And so it was nice to baptize a few kids on the same day they announced it. So I'm in the baptismal when the pastor's telling everybody that I'm leaving. And so that was special to do that. But that was all. So it's concentric circles. And every time the circle gets bigger, the distance between those circles gets smaller because of the time dilation between of who knows what's in there. And so and then once you've told the whole congregation, that's when the new church you're going to, that's when they can announce. And that's when you can do your social media post that gets 500 likes on it. Right. That's when you got to clue everybody in, because you're going to be tempted to just announce it because hey, this could be like a step up for you. This is a new place. You're all excited about this new journey, but you have to honor the relationships in there. And I like the way that Lisa Turkhurst talks about it when she's talking about boundaries and people who have access to you. The people who have that top 10 level access to you, they get to know first. Okay. The congregation member that you talk to, just saying, hey, when they're making the coffee before the service, they don't get to find out about what's going on. Right. They find out about everybody else. But that leader who's been right there beside you, working the late nights as you're painting the final VBS decorations, you need to tell them personally. That needs to have a personal conversation. There needs to be tears and there needs to be hugs and just let all of those emotions happen.
Yeah. Amen.
All right, friends, thank you so much for joining us today. We hope that you enjoyed this conversation with David as much as we did. We mentioned earlier that this is just part 1. So look forward next week for part 2 of our conversation with David. And we just hope that you will do all the things for us on the socials, that you will like and subscribe. You'll check us out on Spotify or Podbean or Apple Podcasts or YouTube. Check out our Pinterest and our Instagram, as well as looking at our new blog that we set up. So we just appreciate all your support and all your encouragement and everything you do. And we look forward to talking to you again soon. Bye-bye.